Hi, everyone. I'm Szkoda Wasińska, and I'm here with Marta Usiekniewicz and with our guest, Sam McBean. So let me now introduce our guest in today's lecture. Sam McBean is a senior lecturer in gender, sexuality, and contemporary culture at Queen Mary University of London. She's the author of Feminism's Queer Temporalities from Routledge from 2016 and has published on contemporary literature, culture, queer and feminist theory in journals including Feminist Review, Feminist Theory, Camera Obscura, and New Formations. So Sam, the floor is yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I want to say a couple thanks to begin. This all kind of started when I met Tomek Basiuk in 2019 in Vienna. And I think the sort of invitation to potentially come speak at Warsaw started with him, although I know he's not able to be here, I don't think today, but I wanted to thank him anyways. And also Agnieszka, who I met, we just realized in 2013 at the University of Gothenburg. So thinking about, I guess my title has the kind of idea of networks in it. So thinking about the sort of networks and where they lead us. So I wanted to thank Agnieszka and also Marta, both of whom helped with the kind of logistics for today and all of the kind of admin of getting me here virtually. So thank you. So I wanted to say a note on this work. It's a new piece of work and a work that kind of comes out of a strange year. A year where I played a lot with my own writing style. So I had a little bit of disillusion with certain kinds of academic conventions, and I started to write a little bit more creatively. And this is part of an attempt, I think, to mix some of that creative writing in with potentially more academic, a more familiar academic style. So it might work, it might not work, but there is a kind of play with form and voice here. It's also part of a kind of larger project and larger thinking about the relationship between queerness and form. So thinking about how we might imagine queerness not only in relation to identity, but in relation to patterns, social patterns, bodily patterns, patterns of desire. So thinking with a kind of formal imaginary. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 40, I'm looking down, I've got my talk in front of me. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. And the talk today, called Queer Ecological Networks, has kind of a couple nodes or a couple points of interest. It's framed around the photographer Ren Hang's work, and I'll offer a reading of his work, but also thinking with a sort of personal narrative of ex-lovers and pets, which I'll be sort of braiding together a kind of reading of Hang, a reading of queer intimacies, a reading of sort of animals, and also sort of using queer ecology as a kind of frame. But I also know that this is a colloquium on American studies, so there is perhaps surprisingly going to be a kind of braiding in of a reading of Juna Barnes' Nightwood as well, through this frame of lovers and pets. Okay, hopefully it all hangs together. We'll see as we go. Okay, I'm just gonna get my screen up. Okay, so last February, I attended the photographer Ren Hang's retrospective titled Love Ren Hang at the Gallery CO Berlin. Hang began taking photos at age 20 in 2007 and worked until his death in 2017. He's perhaps best known for the photos he took of friends, arranging their naked bodies, often in small white bedrooms, but also hanging off trees, submerged in streams, and embracing on the tops of buildings. At the entrance to the exhibition in Berlin, there was a warning sign which read, and I quote, "Individual artworks in the current exhibition might hurt your personal feelings or offend your moral sensibilities." Despite knowing that during his lifetime, Hang repeatedly battled accusations of obscenity for his representations of naked bodies and what they might do, especially from within his native China, I was surprised to find this warning in 2020 in Berlin. What, I wondered, could these photos do to wound anyone's feelings? I had a sense, of course, that it might have something to do with the queerness of the photos, the images of men wrapped around each other, body parts in mouths, or women holding on to each other, cupping crotches with lacquered nails. His photos chase after an erotics, an intimacy that isn't limited to the heterosexual. I wrote about the retrospective soon after I saw it. In my review, I argued for the queerness of Hang's work. I located this queerness not in his identity as a gay man, something he never really talked about in any sort of long way in public, nor in the photograph's explicit representations of same-sex eroticism. Instead, I considered his play with the patterning of bodies, with how bodies might be in relation to each other. I thought about the relationship between patterning and desire. Sarah Ahmed in Queer Phenomenology notes the spatial connotations of the term sexual orientation. Sexual orientation asks after who or what your desire is oriented towards, where your body is pointed, how it is aligned, and in relation to who or what. Sexual orientation as a term, or to think about sexuality as an orientation, suggests that desire is about directionality, positionality, an arrangement in space. The exhibition made me think about what forms human bodies can take, or are expected to take, in relation to each other, how heteronormativity shapes bodies and what they can do. It made me think about how play with orientation, with patterning, with the shapes that bodies might make, might be a queer aesthetic. David Getze, in a piece about queer formalism, argues that, and I quote, desire, the sexual, and the gendered operate beyond their straightforward depictions. So that we can think about a kind of queerness that isn't about a straightforward depiction of same-sex eroticism. So how might we kind of imagine that play with formalism? And so Getze suggests that a queer aesthetic might exceed explicit representations of queer intimacies. Kaji Amin, Amber Jamila Musser, and Roy Perez build on this to argue that formal experimentation might, and I quote, fray the apparent self-evidence of social patterns. Hang's subjects grab at each other, hold mouths open, and contort around each other in often disorienting ways, fraying perhaps the norms of desire, playing with the possibilities of contact and connection. So my original quite short review of the exhibition is titled Bent Out of Shape, a play on the homophobic term bent, where to be bent is to be misshapen, malformed, pointed in the wrong direction. Ahmed explains that queer sexualities are seen as odd, bent, twisted. Queer, in this understanding, is disorienting. She explains, and I quote, that queer unfolds from the life worlds of those who do not or cannot inhabit the contours of heterosexual space. If queerness might challenge then the norms of desires, orientations, the patterning of bodies spatially and socially, then Hang's play with arranging bodies differently might be what make his photography queer. So this was my original argument. This was my original reading of this exhibition and of Hang's photographs. Soon after I made this argument though, again at the beginning of 2019, the exhibition closed. Then all of the exhibitions in Berlin closed. The city, like many other cities, entered into the first of what was to be many lockdowns. In the absence of art galleries, I learned instead to watch the birds. I don't think I'm alone in this sort of turn to nature in lockdown. I, like many other people, spent hours walking the city's canals, discovering the spots that the swallows liked, learning the times they could usually be swatted out feeding. Early evenings were best. I walked through Berlin's big city parks and began to recognize the bird species there, the mating calls of the skylarks and the screeching sounds of the swifts. When the outdoor swimming pool opened in June, it became apparent that in our human absence, a kettle of swallows had made the space their home. I would swim laps as they careened around me, dipping into the pool to drink from the same water I was pushing my body through. I felt the same pleasure that Catriona Mortimer Sandilands and Bruce Erickson in Queer Ecologies identify in ecological writing as, and I quote, a phenomenological interaction with the expanse of that which is beyond the human, an inquisitive openness to new pleasures. While the birds and the pleasures that they brought me felt initially like a very different pursuit to the research I was doing in relation to kind of queer patterns, queer intimacies, I started to think about how they might be brought together. or perhaps we're already entangled. As Mortimer Sandilands and Erikson argue, it is perhaps an openness to pleasure and excess that might link queer theory to ecology, this openness to pleasure and excess. So queer attachments, they write, work both to celebrate the excess of life and to politicize the sites at which this excess is eradicated. So if queerness is partly about exposing the limits placed on pleasure, on desire, on what bodies can do by heteronormativity, about politicizing how these boundaries are drawn and excess is denied, then ecological thought, with its emphasis on connections, entanglements, life's kind of surplus, might be queer theory's perfect bedfellow. As Timothy Morton argues in an early piece on queer ecology, ecology shows us that, and I quote, life is catastrophic, monstrous, non-holistic, and dislocated, not organic, coherent, or authoritative. So this thinking together of queerness and ecology, or a kind of queer ecology, had me wanting to revisit Hang's work to see what I didn't see the first time, to see what I didn't see before I started watching the birds. And what I didn't see was all of the kind of non-human others in his photos. Alongside photos of human bodies are octopi, snakes, fish, pigeons, swans, peacocks, flowers, and foliage of all kinds. That the subjects in his photography aren't just entangled with each other, but also are kind of complicated, woven, and here in this is a good image, kind of woven into non-human others and entangled in non-human others as well. And when I first saw the exhibition, when I was first thinking about Hang, I never looked at these photos. Like, these photos didn't have the same kind of interest to me. They weren't the focus of my original writing, but when I reread this original piece, I sort of saw the glimmers of the non-human kind of trying to get in. So, and what I mean that while I didn't focus on these particular images in that first review, there's a couple moments where I talk about kind of non-human others. So I describe at one point the way that the bodies in some of Hang's work look like landscape, so don't look actually like human flesh at all. I say at another point that the show, or certain images from the show, reminded me of a quote from Juna Barnes' Nightwood, in which lesbian lovers are compared to poor beasts that get their antlers mixed. So I kind of use this metaphor from Barnes to make sense of a kind of entanglement, a human entanglement in the photos. More centrally though, in my original review, I tell a story in the piece of reuniting with my ex. I was sitting on her sofa to mourn her dead cat, my ex-cat, our former cat, a cat that she took in the breakup. I use the example to think about the shapes that we might make with our exes, how we might reorient our bodies in relation, how queer culture might be about inventing new kinds of intimacies, where exes might play a central role in this world building. So I was thinking together Hang's photography, thinking about queer world making and patterns, but also specifically telling a story about friendship with exes and reorienting our relationships. And I guess thinking about the kind of creativity of certain kinds of community and kin building and the history of that within queer culture. So I don't, though, in the original piece, linger on the cat's centrality to the shapes our bodies made that day, that it was the cat's death that brought me back into a kind of physical orientation in relation to my ex. In the original piece, the non-human, both in Hang's photos and also in my own storytelling, was the background for my human arguments about touch, relationships, and human bodies in configuration. They weren't part of the story I told about the potential queerness of Hang's photos, nor were they central to the story I was telling about ex-lovers and queer intimacies. But they are the story I want to pursue now, and a story that will bring me back in the end to my ex and a cat, a different cat. Okay, so I basically want to look now, or rewrite some of the work I did earlier, to think about the ways that animals or non-human others are part of Hang's work, and to think about how we can read that in relation to this sort of thinking about patterns and queer desire. and also look again at how animals might have been central to my own kind of personal narrative in relation to queer intimacies and exes. Don't worry, it's not as oversharey as it sounds, hopefully. Okay, so I first though, oh, sorry, I stopped that too soon. I first want to start with a section which I've called Nature is Queer AF. When I was writing this piece, I went for a walk, as I usually do, to this, there's a canal and a kind of nature reservoir just near where I'm now living in East London. And on the bridge to the kind of nature reservoir, I saw this sticker, which I thought was appropriate. But I'm going to pause the PowerPoint now. Okay, so Nature is Queer AF. And I'm going to trace here some ways of thinking about queer ecology and offer a kind of reading of Hang's work through that framework. So the non-human term of recent decades has seen many thinkers turning away from the human, questioning what Dana Luciano and Mel Y. Chen describe as, and I quote, our automatic recourse to the human as both the center of our analysis and the ground of any epistemology. In their introduction to the journal GLQ's special issue on queer inhumanisms, they explore the specific stakes of queer theories turned to the non-human. So thinking about a kind of general turn to the non-human across certain kinds of humanity disciplines, but thinking about the way there's sort of stakes specifically in relation to queerness and queer theory. So the title of their piece, Has the Queer Ever Been Human?, gestures to the potential proximity that queerness has always had to the non-human. Pointing to histories of the dehumanization of the queer and also the racialized or otherwise marginalized body, they note that many foundational queer theoretical texts have drawn attention to how the norms of sexuality are part of how the human is both constituted and regulated. In other words, what counts as human, or in Judith Butler's term, gender and sexual norms. Queer theory then has been suspicious of the category of the human. So has a history of thinking about how that category has been exclusionary, and specifically how that category functions or makes sense in relation to a set of norms around gender and sexuality, like who gets to be human. So queer theory has often sort of argued against the kind of the human, and as Leo Bersani does in Is the Rectum a Grave, suggests that queerness might be about the breakdown of the human itself. In response, though, to the titular question of whether the queer has ever been human, they answer both no and yes. No, because of these histories of dehumanization leveled at queerness and the ways this has led to persistent critiques within queer theory of the violences of liberal humanist subjectivity. But also yes, because the human body and human sexuality and human desire has been a privileged site of queer analysis. So they sort of suggest that while we can kind of trace within a history of queer thought, a skepticism around the category of the human, and a kind of tracing the history of how that category has been exclusionary and has been wielded with violence against those who are sort of gender and sexually non-conforming, that there's a kind of paradox because the human has remained the kind of central object or subject position that most queer theory has kind of proceeded from. So while there's been a kind of skepticism of the human, so much of queer theory has been focused on and kind of centered the human as well. So they suggest then that a more focused encounter with the non-human might expand, and I quote, queer past its conventional resonances as a container for human sexual non-normativities, forcing us to ask once again what sex and gender might look like apart from the anthropocentric forms with which we have become perhaps too familiar. So the starting point for kind of queer ecological work is the decentering of a kind of the human in relation to how we think about sex and gender. So for instance, Elizabeth Wilson argues that, and I quote, nature is already generatively and happily perverse in ways that might challenge cultural-centric theories of difference, embodiment, and identity. Myra J. Hurd argues that most plants are intersex, most fungi have multiple sexes, many species transsex, and bacteria completely defy notions of sexual difference. From this perspective, Hurd asks why more humans aren't trans, right? So thinking about how some of this work is about looking at how reproduction, sex, gender works in non-human others, and using that as a way to kind of challenge certain presumptions that we've held on to in relation to sex and gender in the human. So for Hurd, if the question is often, or the question is often like, why do people transition? That is a kind of particularly sticky move. As Stacey Alamo argues, nature and the natural have long been categories used violently against queers, as well as women, people of color, and indigenous peoples. Heterosexuality has been normalized again and again through recourse to its naturalness, and that there's a kind of deep skepticism to the concept of the natural within a lot of queer writing. In Caspar Heinemann's words, nature becomes a weaponized synonym for reproduction. Nature then has informed discourses of sexuality, that the kind of mobilization of that language, of that concept, has informed discourses of sexuality, but also discourses of sexuality have informed the study of nature. So with many arguing that ecological studies have carried with them presumptions about heterosexuality, intimacy, and reproduction from heteronormative human contexts. So that there's a kind of argument that a lot of histories of ecological study have seen heterosexuality in non-human others, have written on to the natural world or to non-human worlds categories that come from kind of human. So not actually looking at nature on its own terms or outside of our human concepts. So there's been a kind of straightening of nature, and nature has been used in a kind of straightening force in relation to humanity, or to the human. So queer ecology then, the argument is partly about looking at nature from the perspective of non-normative sexual and gender positions, while also using nature as a lens through which to rethink our human understandings of sex, gender, and desire. Morton argues that, and I quote, "To contemplate ecology's unfathomable intimacies is to imagine pleasures that are not heteronormative, not genital, not geared to ideologies about where the body stops and starts." So a kind of emphasis on excess, entanglement, and a kind of potentially an eroticism of this state. And I guess I have a question about what makes ecology, or one way to think about what makes ecology queer. Is there something that queer theory does to not only emphasize the entanglements of species, but also to potentially play with the kind of eroticism of this entanglement, or eroticism of connection? Okay, I'm gonna bring Hang back. Okay, so in Hang, human bodies are paired with plants, animals, and landscapes. In many, the boundaries between the human and the non-human are deliberately blurred. For instance, in a series of images with birds and fish, the non-human eye is layered over top of human subjects. The flatness of the photographic plane collapsing perhaps the human and the animal together, layered, collaged. In other photos, flowers replace faces, or faces become flowers, or nipples are stretched so that they look almost flower-like. Hang's photos play with the boundaries between species, entangling the human and the non. But I think there's a sort of, or part of the eroticism that's located in Hang's photos more generally is also located in these photos, which is to say that the photos where humans are entangled with the non-human, with non-human others, don't sit outside, I think, the photos of humans licking or touching or entangled with each other. Much like the photos of human bodies entangled in strange ways produces a kind of eroticism that isn't always genital, that definitely isn't always heterosexual and frequently isn't linked to the couple. The images that entwine the human and the non play with the possibilities of eroticism across species, or at the very least, find pleasure in the possibilities beyond human touch. In one image, a human subject reaches their tongue out to a dangling plant. The human subject gazes up, near submissive-like, perhaps kneeling. The tongue reaches toward the flower, but is also juxtaposed with it, each reaching toward the other. In another image, a human figure is curled into a kind of ball, balancing on their shoulders, back facing the camera. The subject's anus is open to a bouquet of tulips that are pouring water onto, perhaps into, the human. A subtle reference here, perhaps, to the way that especially gay men have been entangled with the feminine, the flowery, the pansy. The flower and the gay man are mutually constituted. So these images are sort of suggesting that one way to read Hang's work might be through the way it doesn't limit entanglements and eroticism to human-human touch or human-human contact. The way it approaches non-human others from the perspective of non-normative gender and sexual subject positions, but also the way the animals and non-human others might contribute to the photo's queerness, the kind of decentering of the human. So how the kind of non-human others don't sit outside of the potential queer eroticism of the photos, but might be necessary to them. Like, how do we read this together? Those photos of entanglements with animals and the photos of entanglements between and across humans. Okay. Okay, this section thinks a little bit more about this question of patterns, and it is the section where I will get to exes and pets. So, if a turn to the ecological, to the non-human, is a recent orientation for queer thought, a concern with taxonomy, with arrangement, has been there from the beginning. And I guess this is one of the things that I thought about when I started thinking about queer ecology, that if the kind of non-human turn might be something new, a kind of interest in patterns, an interest in arrangements, an interest in sort of rebuilding different kinds of worlds in some ways, has a kind of deeper history. So, for instance, the concept of taxonomy comes up in a very early piece, if not one of the earliest pieces of queer theory, in Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. So in Epistemology of the Closet, Eve Sedgwick introduces her concept of nonce taxonomy. Nonce, as well as being slang for sexual deviant, describes a word or expression that is coined for one specific occasion. It's created for a single occasion to solve an immediate problem of communication, a word that is made up to communicate something on the move. So children make up nonce words quite a lot to sort of express something when you can't grasp a word. We also might do it sort of making a kind of an amalgamation of two words to communicate something. Some nonce words go on to become common language, while others remain just single purpose sounds. So if that's nonce, taxonomy, of course, refers to the branch of biology concerned with the classification of organisms, the science of naming, defining, and arranging a world. A nonce taxonomy, then, is a way to name a temporary system of classification, or the necessity of making up a whole way of understanding relation when there are no existing terms. So rather than just a word, a kind of nonce taxonomy is a whole made-up arrangement of organizing the world. Given the association between nonce words and temporariness, a nonce taxonomy is also a way to think flexibly about relationality. It might be a system of understanding that is needed, but also might be discarded as well. And so Sedgwick uses this term, nonce taxonomy, and it's not a term that, I've tried tracing it, it's not a term that really gets taken up in a lot of work post-Sedgwick, even as Sedgwick is often described for the way she's interested in patterns and patterning and desires kind of patterns. Nonce taxonomy is one that doesn't really have a lot of traction beyond Sedgwick. But Sedgwick uses it to describe the way that particularly queer people have had to make up ways of understanding the social world, inventing categories, identities, and relationalities to explain their existence, attachments, and intimacies. So things like butch, femme, butch, daddy, high femme, gal pal, etc. So Non's taxonomy is, I think, for Cedric, one way that queer people have often built worlds that might be flexible and might be open to change in a context in which the language or intimacies don't exist. So Non's taxonomy then for Cedric is, and I quote, this is from Cedric, the making and unmaking and remaking and redissolution of hundreds of old and new categorical imaginings concerning all the kinds it may take to make up a world. So a kind of creativity around world building in relation to desire. Jose Esteban Munoz writes that, and I quote, queer thought is in large part about casting a picture of arduous modes of relationality that persist in the world despite stratifying demarcations and taxonomies of being. So of course, I'm sort of struck again by the use of the word taxonomy in Munoz, who's not really talking about ecology. That queerness is about modes of relationality that are in excess to or breach certain boundaries of relationality. In both Munoz and Cedric is the realization that desire is inventive, that queerness might be about imagining new kinds of taxonomies, new kinds of patterns, ways of organizing the world. Sarah Ahmed argues that to make things queer is certainly to disturb the order of things. Sexual disorientation slides quickly into social disorientation as a disorientation in how things are arranged. So I guess what I've been trying to do is sort of trace how this interest in taxonomy or interest in rearranging, which has seemed to come out a lot in the kind of turns of queer ecology, to thinking about connections and entanglements across species, actually has a kind of longer history within queer thought. That interest in taxonomy, in relations across prescriptions, across boundaries, has perhaps been always kind of there in different language. I also like how kind of ecological language comes out in Munoz's use of taxonomy, and in the Ahmed almost evolutionary thought, the order of things, right? Queerness is about disturbing the order of things, which has a kind of ecological resonance as well. Okay, so which is just sort of me saying that I think there's a way to link queer ecology to not just a kind of blurring across species, but to an interest in patterns and new kinds of a kind of queer history of thinking about the inventiveness of desire and desire's ability to make new kinds of taxonomies, perhaps. So when I saw the Hang exhibition last February, I'd been thinking a lot about exes. I'd recently moved to Berlin and reconnected with an ex who lives there. I'd been thinking about how we were relearning how to be bodies in proximity, how a certain way of being in relation to each other needed to change, had changed. Going out, dancing together, our bodies close like they used to be, but different, reconfigured, without that old spark of desire. It had also been just over a year since a big breakup, the end of a very important relationship, or I should say the reshaping of a very important relationship, and our cat had recently died, the cat from the sofa earlier. I was trying to make sense of how we had to relearn new ways of being bodies together, new ways of touching, of arranging ourselves, potentially new taxonomies. I was thinking about all of this as I looked at Hang's images of bodies in strange configurations, testing out how relation might work, what kinds of touches were possible. And something in the images makes this testing, this precarity, this touching, full of possibility, of creativity, of potential. I used Hang to tell a story of the possibility of being friends with exes, of relearning patterns of relation, of thinking about how this might be a pleasurable thing rather than, rather than a loss. I don't know if you heard that ringing. How a kind of reconfiguring sets of relationships might not be about loss, but might be about creativity. It might be about pleasure. And taking pleasure in how we might reconfigure our relationships. I thought of this as part of the creativity of certain queer cultures, and kind of linked that possibility and that play as central to certain queer cultures. The ability to challenge existing categories, to make them do different things. And I was thinking a lot of the time, there's a zine that circulates, and the title of the zine, a queer zine, is called The Ex-Girlfriend of My Ex-Girlfriend is My Girlfriend. So thinking about the kind of entanglements of exes in queer culture. Okay, so now I want to think about how animals might be part of this story of ex-lovers and pets, and I ask for your indulgence. And I want to go back in order to do this to the comparison I initially made between Ren Hang's work and Juna Barnes' Nightwood, as a kind of bridge for thinking about the queer non-human, but also queer intimacies and actual animals. Okay. So as I've already raised, I'm just going to put that one back up. As I've already raised, my initial review of Hang quoted a passage from Juna Barnes' novel Nightwood. So this 1936 high modernist novel, if it can be summarized, is partly about the torments of lesbian or queer love and desire. A great deal of the novel follows Nora Flood as she mourns the loss of her lover, Robin Vogt, who she's lost to Jenny Petherbridge. Robin, for her sake, the kind of lost lover, is equally tormented, spending much of the novel wandering the night, hungry like an animal. The passage that I was initially interested in thinking with the Hang images was about the three women locked together like beasts with their antlers tangled, so kind of entanglement of ex-lovers. But the book as a whole consistently plays with the language of animality, the boundaries between the human and the non-human, and also with kind of linking queerness in with the kind of not quite human, especially with the character of Robin. So Robin, who's one of the most, perhaps the most legibly kind of lesbian characters in the book, is repeatedly described as almost animal-like, as kind of wandering the streets, like a feral animal, as sort of being untamed or untamable, as not quite fitting in the kind of world, and through recourse to links to animality. She's described at one point as like a beast in a painting by Henri Rousseau. And these are the images. So when I teach Nightwood, I show these are paintings by Rousseau that I imagine we're supposed to conjure when Robin is described like an animal in these paintings. I think they're also strikingly similar in some ways to some of the Hang photos as I looked at them again in preparation for this talk. So placing the kind of human in amongst a kind of foliage or landscape. So now I want to look at the controversial coda to the novel quite briefly. In the novel's final scene, where we get a kind of scene of an entanglement between the kind of human and the non-human, the human and the animal. So the novel has a kind of controversial ending. And this ending sees Robin and Nora kind of reunited. So Nora has lost Robin, they've parted, but in the end, they both end up in America, and Robin ends up in a church, sort of wandering in a church, and Nora is nearby, and Nora's dog kind of goes a bit crazy and runs out of the house to the church where Robin is, and Nora follows the dog. Okay, and then this is the scene that ensues, and I'm going to quote it in some detail. So this is the scene between Nora's dog, who is Robin's ex-lover. So Robin is rolling around with her ex-lover's dog. Robin began going down. Sliding down she went, down, her hair swinging, her arms held out, and the dog stood there, rearing back, his forelegs slanting, his paws trembling under the trembling of his rump, his hackle about his neck standing out stiff and beautiful, his mouth open, his tongue slung sideways over his sharp, bright teeth, whining and waiting. And down she went until her head swung against his, on all fours now, dragging her knees. Then she began to bark also, crawling after him. Barking in a fit of laughter, obscene and touching. The dog began to cry then, running with her, head on with her head, as if to circumvent her. Soft and slow, his feet went padding. He ran this way and that, low down in his throat crying, and she grinning and crying with him, crying in shorter and shorter spaces, moving head to head until she gave up, lying out, her hands beside her, her face turned and weeping. And the dog too gave up then and lay down, his eyes bloodshot, his head flat along her knees. So the scene's been a sticking point in interpretations of the novel. It's sometimes been ignored completely, especially in early readings of the text. Jane Marcus describes it as, and I quote, the novel's controversial last scene with the dog, and that's all that she says about it. It's sometimes been eroticized more recently, read by Teresa de Lauretis for its orgasmic qualities, the sort of build up, and then a kind of denouement, a kind of build up of the crying, and then a kind of failed potential orgasmic moment, according to de Lauretis. It's also been read in relation to the novel's disruption of the category of the human. It's also been read for its queer potential, for the way it embraces animality and shame, so that if Robin has been described throughout the novel as potentially animalistic, as not quite human, that in this final scene, potentially we get a reclamation of that position, a sort of reveling in the non-human. As Elizabeth Blake argues throughout the novel, Robin is figured as beast turning human, and so potentially this final scene is a pleasurable reclamation of that category of becoming animal. Here, much like in Hang's photos, the boundaries between the human and the non-human are a site of play and a potential erotics. So I kind of want to suggest that while originally I took such a small quote from the novel to think about Hang, that this scene now seems more appropriate to kind of juxtapose with and alongside Hang's work. A kind of scene of human and non-human entanglement, a potential erotics, but also a kind of an illegibility as well around those erotics, a productive illegibility. It's also a scene that, much like Hang's work, is interested in this at a kind of formal level, at the level of patterns and patterning shapes. And I think this is the sort of this, as I think about it now, this isn't a clear scene of erotics, but there is a kind of reorientation or a disorientation or a play with spatial movement that's potentially has a certain kind of creativity and potential to it. And can we kind of locate queerness there, I guess. So we're first told that Robin bows down to the dog's level, contorting her body, then the dog crouches down to meet her before they run head to head together. So much like in Hang's work, this sort of play with how to be in relation, testing out different ways of moving together, different ways of shaping each other, different shapes that you might make together. It ends with the lying down, he on top of her, his head on her knees. They almost depict what Donna Haraway, in her own exploration between the human and the non-human, describes as the dance of relating, where the dancers are redone through the patterns they enact. This phrase comes from her book Companion Species, where she thinks about our human entanglement with non-human others. She's particularly interested in dogs, with the book beginning with her question, whom and what do I touch when I touch my dog? Arguing that touch peppers its partners with attachment sites for world making. So for Haraway, we're all constituted in these kind of intra and interactions. And this is Haraway, the partners do not precede the meeting. Species of all kind, living and not, are consequent on a subject and object shaping dance of encounters. Haraway's question is partly about opening up a curiosity to the histories of encounters that have led to the possibility of touching this dog now. So the histories of industrialization, of environment, of breeding, a way to acknowledge that every encounter, every touch comes about because of a whole host of other encounters that we only become and only are through these encounters. So that there's something about being made and unmade through encounters that I think is legible in this scene. A kind of undoing of the human and undoing of the non-human, a redoing in this kind of relational dance, rolling around, whining, crying. But I think Robin's dance is slightly different, like I don't want to stop there. Yes, I think we could use Haraway to think about a confusion of boundaries, of interaction, of species being constituted in relation, an undoing, a redoing. We could also embrace the queer potential, potentially, of this becoming animal. But this is also a scene of longing, sadness, intimacy, made intense, because this is Nora's dog, and Nora is there watching. And I think it's quite striking that Nora is not often mentioned in analyses of this scene, and that it's often the pairing of Robin and the dog. The focus is usually on the two of them, a pair, a refusal, or a play with the binaries, whereas they kind of stand for the animal, the human, the sacred, the profane. But this scene, its pattern, involves a third. It isn't a scene of two, but of three. Robin's dance involves not only a dog, but also an ex, the owner of the dog. Nora, who watches from the entrance to the church. Nora, who is stood in the door jamb. And the scene is partly potentially focalized through Nora, so we're also sort of seeing it from Nora's perspective. Nora, to whom the dog belongs, to whom Robin's love once belonged. So if I might slightly alter Haraway's original question, we could ask, whom and what do I touch when I touch my lesbian ex-lover's dog? What is this encounter? What are its erotics? If you'll allow me one more alteration to Haraway's question, I would ask, whom and what do I touch when I touch my lesbian ex-lover's cat? As I was preparing this talk, my ex, the one I used to share a cat with, asked me to cat sit for her. In the time since we broke up, and the time since our cat had died, she's got a new cat. She has a new cat now. And as I write this, her cat has just left my flat after a week of cohabitation. This new cat, the same breed as our old cat, brought back memories of this old cat. I found that I kept trying to touch her the way I touched her old cat. I struggle with possessive pronouns with this cat. I kept trying to curl my body around this new cat the way the old cat liked. But she had different desires. She wanted to make different shapes. I watched her over the first few days be frustrated with how my body was positioned. She would attempt to sit with me, but get restless, sit in front of me, meowing, seemingly annoyed. I couldn't figure out what she wanted, and she couldn't tell me. We were, as Anna Marie Jagosi describes it, two unlike animals bound together by a mutual and anticipatory attentiveness to the animation and intentionality of the other. Despite these initial irritations with each other, we were attentive, searching for each other's intentions. And over the week, we taught each other new ways of being. I learned that she wanted to sleep on my chest, neatly curled around my neck, and I obliged. And she learned that this didn't really work while I was sitting at my desk trying to teach. She learned to sit on my lap, something my ex said she never did before. We learned to put our bodies in relation, found ways of orienting our bodies around each other, made new shapes. Or in Haraway's words, we were training each other in acts of communication we barely understood. We make each other up, Haraway suggests, in the flesh. But of course, it wasn't just me and the cat, just like it wasn't just Robin and the dog. There were our exes. I was acutely aware of my ex's body that week. When I couldn't sit the way the cat wanted me to, I was aware that my ex's body had imprinted on the cat, was imprinted on the cat. The cat's flesh was made up in relation to her, in their encounters. The cat wanted me to assume the shapes that my ex makes because she was made in relation to that body, its shapes. The kind of history of encounters was imprinted on her, and my history of encounters with other animals was imprinted on me, and we brought those into our encounters with each other. I think about Robin in the church with Nora's dog, and it isn't just about Robin and the dog, the human and the animal, a pair. It's about Robin and Nora and the dog. It's about Robin's encounter with her ex-lover's animal. In moving in relation to the dog, she was also moving in relation to her ex. They're all tangled up. Okay, to bring this to a conclusion. When I initially saw the Hang exhibition in Berlin, it helped me think about the relationship between queerness, bodies, and patterns. It made me think about the relationship between aesthetic patterns, shapes, and bodies, and a reorientation of the social, that the two things might be linked. It also seemed to express something of what I was thinking about my own relationships, my exes, and the ways we were learning to make new shapes in relation to each other. It voiced something about how relationships and their changing natures is felt at the bodily level, at how we position ourselves in relation to each other physically. I saw Hang's images and thought about how he positioned his friends, about the play with arrangements. I didn't see initially the way this extended past or beyond the human, neither in Hang's work nor in my story of exes and queerness. Jean Vaccaro, writing about environmental risk, cohabitation, art, and transgender experience, writes that, and I quote, "We is an idea and a problem, a shape to ask after." I see in Hang's work now how this play with patterns, with ways of relating, includes non-human others. The we in Hang's work is more than the human. I also see now that my original story about my relationship with my ex can't be told without our old cat, without her new cat. And I think there's something here, something I'm risking or gesturing at with this sort of personal narrative, is thinking about the non-human, not just in a kind of abstract way of thinking about entanglements, but actually taking account of lived experiences with actual animals and how to think that together in relation to queer community, queer intimacies, and how to kind of theorize that, which I think is a risk that I'm taking. So in the end, I think it's not just so much a way of looking at nature from the perspective of sexual non-normativity, nor is it about challenging human categories of sex and gender from the perspective of the non-human, but it's about exploring a queer commitment to disorder, to new taxonomies, to the possibilities of pattern and touch that are excessive, that might include pets, but they can also take account of the way we shape each other and might reshape each other, where the each and other are both open questions rather than stable points of departure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have a little bit of time for a Q&A. So if you have questions, please, you can type them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand or indicate in the chat that you would like to ask a question. But I think we need a minute or two to articulate our questions. And since I already have my mic on, I might start of the discussion. First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed that, and it kind of crisscrosses with a lot of things that I've been reading and I'm interested in. So that was super interesting, and I love Ren Hang's photography as well. So this was super cool. Again, it's I'm kind of embarrassed a little bit because I don't really have a question. It's a kind of a comment/question, which is something I always do. So many thoughts, exactly. So I'll try to make it into sort of a question, because I've been thinking about race in all of that, in those discussions, and specifically about this danger that I kind of associate, for instance, with Timothy Morton. That I remember kind of reading a critique of his writing. I think it was Rosie Braidotti who said that there's this. She's kind of quite vicious in his in the kind of in his in this critique, that that he kind of exemplifies. And I love Timothy Morton, so that's my statement here and my confession. But she kind of said that, and I kind of agree with that. That this is this kind of white masculinity that doesn't really see itself as white or masculine, right? That there's this all this notion of dark ecology, or ecology with no about nature, that it also evacuates kind of very very important and very kind of pressing political concerns connected with our embodiment in the sense of how we are racialized, where we're located, what's our kind of geographical or geopolitical status as well, but also our gender or gender identity, gender expression, and kind of wondering, going back to Ren Hang's photography. And here's the question that is not really a question, like what are your thoughts on that, on this perhaps this danger of evacuation of race or political concerns connected with embodiment, but in this very much maybe even a kind of Marxist sense, right? That we are kind of bogged down by our class, by our status, by our geography, not just by nature, and I'm putting nature in quote marks here. Okay, so that's it. I don't know, that was more of a question of a comment. I'm sorry that was so, I was rambling a little bit. I can reformulate it a little bit if you need me to.
No, I think that's quite lots for me. I think it's a really important and really good question. And in some ways, I'm not a huge fan of Morton. And one of the dangers, I think, with some of the work that I've read on queer ecology, and I think some of my readings of Morton, is the kind of flattening, right? That there's a tendency in some writing on thinking about queerness in relation to nature, that it's like, oh, look, everything's queer in this sort of like, bacteria is queer, mushrooms are queer, birds are queer, penguins are queer, seagulls are lesbians, or there's a bird, right? Like that everything is kind of queer, and that's a sort of real flattening of what queer is, and potentially a sort of unproductive and colonizing move, right? This is what Jordi Rosenberg writes in an article which is brilliant called The Molecularization of Sexuality. Like if we go down to the idea that atoms are queer and at the base everything is queer, that this is a kind of colonizing project in some ways, a kind of queer colonialism. So I absolutely take that. And I think for me, that's one of the dangers of some of the queer ecology work, is a sort of thinking that all life is somehow queer in this flattening way, which exactly erases all of the kind of categories and markers of identity and difference that still matter. So I would say, yeah, so I also have skepticism of Morton, and also skepticism of some of the kind of non-human turn in queer. And I guess I would go with Jordi Rosenberg and some of the critiques there. That being said, in terms of thinking about race in relation to Ren Hang, this is something that I've been actually trying to develop in a longer version, hopefully what will be a longer version of this. And I haven't, I guess I have to, there was an earlier version of the talk that tried to use Mel Y. Chen's work on animacies, because I think in Chen's work, there's some really interesting thinking around how the category of animacy is sort of not equally spread in terms of race, in terms of racialization, that certain kinds of, that animacy is a racialized category. So my short answer is that I would go to Mel Chen to think about this potentially rather than Braidotti. But why did I not end up including that here? I think I also, I mean, I guess the honest answer is that it's an omission in this piece of work, and it's one that I'm thinking through in relation to that category of animacy, and also obviously the deep understanding that the category of the natural is hierarchized and has different relationships to different individuals, that it's not just the human versus nature, right? That the category of human and what what is pitted against the natural, what is more closely aligned to the natural, obviously has a deep history in relation to colonialism, race and gender and sexuality. So that the kind of binary is false in some ways, right? The human and the non presumes that the human is a cohesive category that has a binary relationship to something called the non, when actually we can think about the kind of history of the natural having a very different relationship to certain kinds of human subjectivities, identity categories. So on the one hand, I'm totally agreeing with you. On the other hand, I'm saying I don't know how to bring that into my analysis of Hang yet, but that I have a feeling it's somewhere located in Mel Chen's work. But yeah, it's definitely something for future. But if you had any nuggets of wisdom or directions to point me in. So I guess I'm sort of saying that I'm also skeptical of some versions of a kind of embracing of the ecological, while also acknowledging that more work needs to be done in terms of thinking about this specifically in relation to race. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think, yeah, I kind of forgot about Chang's, and of course Animacies is the kind of go-to lecture here, and Braidotti, it's just a fragment that I remembered because it's like 2 sentences in one of her books, and so there is no critique, like a very sustained and in-depth critique. It's just that it was very vicious, so I kind of remembered it. It was fun to read, but as I've said, I also kind of like Martin here, and we have something in the chat box, so let me maybe read it out for the recording. So first of all, we have yes, so we have Alison Sperling comment on race and ethnicity is also super entangled in Knightwood's conception of animality. And Zakiya Eman Jackson, right? So I don't know if you'd like to maybe talk about kind of Knightwood a little bit more. It's I have to say that we kind of reminisced a little bit in the back channel. So Marta and I, because we read Knightwood in a class with Christina Mazur, who I think is also with us. So and we kind of went back in time to those times when we were grad students and reading Knightwood and trying to understand it as much as we could, and not that we were very successful, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I fail most times when I both teach and read Knightwood. I think that's part of the experience. I think it's really interesting because I was quite hesitant to bring in Knightwood here, partly because I knew I was doing such a cursory job with it, right? And I think this is one of the things I've been playing around. So I'm probably not going to actually answer this question, that I'm not going to give a more in-depth reading of Knightwood. But what I want to talk about is what happens when we jump around and play with entanglement, right? That partly my talk takes a risk, I think, in moving cursorily between Hang, which can't account for some of the questions of race in Hang, moves between the personal, which is potentially sort of ostracizing or a strange move in relation to the theory, and then takes a little bit from a modernist novel that I don't, thoroughly engage with. And so one of my interests is what are the benefits of that kind of writing? Is there, and I think this deeply relates to this question of entanglements and patterns, right? That there's potentially kind of violence in smushing everything together, right? A violence in cursorily sort of moving between different modes of writing and different modes of analysis, but also thinking about a deep commitment, or at least possibility of playing with what that might do. And I think I sit here as a semi-literary scholar, not an expert in Barnes. And I think I texted before this talk some friends of mine, like, is it okay to just use a bit of Barnes? Without really, really being an expert or even a kind of modernist scholar at all. But thinking that there was something about the Barnes that unlocked the Hang for me, and something about the Hang that unlocked something in the Barnes that I had never thought about in relation to Nora, and that all of that helped me think about something that was going on in my own life. And I guess for me, there's something about, I hope, about queer scholarship or queer feminist scholarship that can play with the possibilities of potentially moving across those modes and what they might let us see. So that isn't an answer to Barnes, but I sort of engineered a different question and answered it around form. So that there's lots of holes, but also a question of like what this kind of entanglement enables. And I think this also speaks to kind of thinking about queer ecology, that an investment in entanglement can potentially be quite violent, can potentially be quite exclusionary, a celebration of entanglement for entanglement's sake, but also potentially quite enabling. And I guess I would say the same in terms of my writing and in terms of this piece, that there's erasures and that there's holes and potential violences, which I'm hearing and thinking about, but then also potentially, hopefully, certain kinds of gains as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that's what I love about it, kind of, new approaches. And again, I don't want to kind of call them new, but I don't know, like new materialism or, queer ecology and this kind of non-human turn. All of those terms are wrong and appropriate at the same time. But I like this kind of experimental nature of doing research and kind of pushing forward. Although, yes, I totally agree that there's always this danger of violence or maybe violation perhaps, and it's but for me, this is, I mean, personally, I find your experiment very successful, and I'm very much convinced by it. And I have a question from Yula Majchak in the comments. I will read it out loud. During the presentation, there were mostly photos of models with tropical plants. Looking at the entire exhibition, were they really in the majority, or was there a bigger diversity in the types of plants? If yes, is it because of this perception of tropical plants as the most sexual ones from a human perspective?
Oh, interesting question. The kinds of plants and the kinds of foliage. I would say that there is, maybe those are the ones that I picked out, which maybe tells you more about what I think are destructive plants than maybe what Ren Hang does. There's quite a lot of trees and play with tree trunks and tree barks that I would say isn't sort of tropical, but is more familiar to someone who grew up in Canada, that kind of like greenery that you can find in that particular belt of the world. So I don't think it's just tropical. I think there's different kinds of plays, yeah, with trees, with streams, with landscapes that go beyond that that particular aesthetic. When I was talking about some of this work with a friend earlier, like, what does it mean to sort of claim that? I guess this is what I'm thinking about in relation to the question. Like, we can think about lots of photography that is has human subjects embedded in nature, or that plays with plants or with flowers, or like, none of this is necessarily new. And I would suggest that Hang's aesthetic is quite interesting, but isn't the only one to sort of situate humans in non-human landscapes. But that trying to talk about the erotics of it is really difficult. Like, right, to say like, I think this is a sexy photo, it's kind of a strange claim. Like, where do we locate an erotics in this photography that potentially other photographs of humans with flowers or humans in streams doesn't quite have? And I was thinking, there's a really nice moment, queer plant sex. Great, yeah. There's a nice moment at the beginning of the article that I mentioned, Has the Queer Ever Been Human?, where they offer a reading of a photographer who places her body in landscapes, sort of compares her body to non-human like stones and shapes in a kind of more desert. And then there's this really interesting moment where Dana Luciano and Mel Y. Chen say, but there's something sexy about these photos. And I kind of like that moment of like wanting to acknowledge it, but having a difficulty in pinpointing it. And I think there's something for me about Hang's work that is so clearly erotic, but that I wouldn't locate it in like naked body parts or genitals or making out, or like scenes that sort of look like sex. And I think that play with what is erotic is what is quite interesting to me, that it's there, but it's also kind of difficult to potentially always locate or describe.
Okay, thank you. So we have comment from Alison Sperling about another kind of Berlin exhibition, and queer plant sex. So yeah, definitely.
That caught my eye as it came up. Yes.
But I also liked Julia's kind of comment about this kind of perception of tropical plants as being kind of more sexualized, and of course this kind of ties into this kind of whole colonization thing, and then how the plants are perceived as kind of more sexual than, I don't know, native plants here in Poland, right? You go outside the field and you don't really see plants which are sexual, and of course their sexual life is pretty awesome, right? When you think about how plants reproduce, and this is they're no different than the plants in I don't know, South Asia, right? They just don't I don't know, trigger associations the way they do. But of course it's not really biological. It's always kind of sifted through our culture. Yeah, but they lend themselves less to suggestive interpretations. I don't know. It might be. We have to go outside and check for ourselves, right? I have a lot of tulips in my small garden, so I should probably kind of take a closer look at their pollinating thingies. Okay, we have Alison who would like to ask a question. So sorry, I'm kind of shutting up.
I figured I should just say hello, because otherwise I'll just dominate the chat. So I'll just say hello and thank you again for all this awesome material. Your archive is super interesting to me, and a lot of texts that I share a lot of investment in. So it was nice to see how you brought them all together. And I also work on Barnes, and so this was really lovely. But I have a kind of, I have two questions. One is a follow-up of Agnieszka's questions about race. Just an invitation if you wanted to talk more, because as I mentioned in the chat, I just read the Zakiya Iman Jackson book, Becoming Human, which I think is really interesting and has a really, really different take to a lot of I would say Black studies conceptions of the human, and rethinking the categories of the human in a really important way. But I was wondering if you wanted to talk more about the ways in which, say, the dehumanization of the human and sort of anti-Blackness, modes of anti-Blackness, or, and other racial categories, versus in kind of way it's also been mobilized in the queer communities, right? This kind of, how are these two things working, in relation for dehumanization and animality and things like this. But the other question is a really kind of quick and easy, maybe suggestion, but I was thinking about the images you showed, the photographs of where the eyes are kind of overlaid. And I was just curious, because I think entanglement is such a, it's been a buzzword for a long time, but this seems like something different, right? It seems like, and you even said replacement, and I wonder if it's also some kind of replacement of the gaze, of the human gaze, right? We think about the male gaze all the time. And I wonder if there's another way to think about how this is replacing the human gaze or non-human gaze, right? Of these peacocks or fish with their eyes kind of overlaid, which seems to be very different than entanglement, actually. So I was wondering if either of those things were something I would talk about, and thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think those are really rich. So I haven't read the Zakiya Iman Jackson yet, although it is on my long reading list for the summer, hopefully. While you were talking, I was thinking about, I guess I was trying to think of a specific example to maybe talk around. And I guess this sort of, and maybe if you wanted to, based on what I say, if you wanted to speak back to what you were thinking about in the text specifically, I guess I was thinking about the potential risks of aligning with the non-human, right? And the way that is riskier in certain racialized categories, which have always been more closely aligned to the non-human, right? Again, not to be too sweeping about that. And I was thinking about Jasmine Ward's book, Salvage the Bones. Okay, which is an amazing text, which is a kind of post-Katrina novel, but that's also about so it's about a kind of family, close-knit family just before Hurricane Katrina, but it's also about the way that they keep dogs and relationship with these dogs that they have, and particularly one of the young boys' relationships with a dog called China. And the book is really amazing because, it's really amazing for lots of reasons, but it risks comparing this sort of poor Black family from the South with these dogs. And it does it quite a lot in the text, comparing each one of the family members, the dog's called China, to China at various moments, and thinking about the dog. It's also about dog fighting, which again, we think about racialized histories of specifically certain kinds of breeds of dogs. In the American context, I'm thinking here. Right, so, but it sort of risks this aligning of this family with the animal, and specifically with the dogs. And whenever I teach it, I think it pulls it off in this kind of amazing way that doesn't kind of flatten, but that carries with it this sort of history of already a kind of close alignment and already a kind of close alignment, but also manages to think across species, even when that risk comes with this kind of legacy of racism and legacy of categories placed onto subject positions that are inhabited by the family. But every time I teach it, I always ask my students, okay, so here we have a poor Black family that's compared to dogs. How does the book pull this off, right? How does it make this comparison? How do we think about entanglements when we're thinking across and sort of with these histories of dehumanization, racialization? And so obviously one impulse would be to never make comparisons, to never think interspecies because of the risks, because of the legacies. But then I think there's texts, and I guess I'm thinking of Jasmine Ward, that don't elide that history of dehumanization, but somehow manage to think entanglement interspecies with it as well. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I guess because one way would be, okay, we can't think like this because of this history of dehumanization, or are there other ways to kind of think interspecies even with and alongside this? Great. Okay. And then I had something about the gaze and the eye. That's good. I hadn't thought about that. That it's the eye specifically being overlaid. And you're right, that it's not necessarily or just or only entanglement. I guess I'm always skeptical. I think the gaze of the animal is so inaccessible, right? And it's so impossible. And I guess some of the play with non-human, new materialism, queer ecology, flirts with the possibility of being able to see outside of the human, right? But I think, as with lots of critiques of, or certain kinds of critiques of the kind of the Anthropocene move, that this position is a kind of fantasy as well. And so I wonder whether there's something about the fantasy of the kind of non-human gaze, rather than a kind of yeah, again, I don't have a full answer to that, but that there's some kind of fantasy there, and I like the idea of thinking about the animal gaze, but it's deeply embedded in and central to certain kinds of ecological thinking that somehow we could get out and we could see, right, that idea that we could reorganize human understandings of sexual desire if we look from the perspective of bacteria, but like that's a kind of fantasy, right? And one that I'm deeply skeptical of in certain kinds of ecological work.
Or nightmare, yeah.
Yeah. Or nightmare. But yeah, that's something to think more about. Thank you.
We have a question from Michalina Czerwońska, so I'll read it out. Do you think that in the photographs, the non-human creatures are presented as subjects or objects? I noticed you mentioned human subjects, meaning that you don't see the fragmentation of the human bodies present in the photos as objectifying. But is this subjectivity extended to non-humans, or are they just props?
Yeah, excellent question. This is something that I've been like grappling with and thinking with, or thought about, and I haven't really answered in some ways. I think sometimes they are props. I think sometimes in the photos they do look like props or kind of draping. I think so. My short answer is yes. Sometimes they look like props, but other times to me it looks like the humans are made as props for the non-human animals. So I didn't show this photo, I think, but I think it was on the photo at the beginning of the slideshow. It was the main photo for the exhibition in Berlin, which is a kind of that human body from the back on their shoulders with their kind of butt in the air, and on top of them is a pigeon. And in that one and photos like that, it's almost like the human body becomes a prop for the animal or the non-human. So I think sometimes the non-human works as a kind of prop for the human subject, but I do think that there's a kind of reverse going on in some of the photos as well, where the human body looks like the kind of stage or prop or setting for a kind of non-human other. Although I guess the idea of extending subjectivity to non-humans is already kind of complicated, right? Depends on how we think about subjectivity. But yeah, so I guess yes and no. I think there are some images where it looks like props, but I do think there's also some attempts to thinking about the human body as a kind of prop, or as unrecognizably human, as a kind of thing that an animal can be a prop for an animal.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments?
If I can, also kind of abusing my privilege as co-organizer. And again, I don't have a question. I just wanted to, I think, express a gratitude for this, you called it, I don't know, an experimental text, and kind of for taking up this experiment. I mean, I think the reason why Agnieszka and I couldn't formulate a proper question is because this text works so well. I had a roller coaster of associations as you were, and kind of on the intellectual level, but also kind of on an embodied level, and to not to highlight our back channel communications too much, but like we were also sharing, like it was really impactful in a way. It made us create networks of associations in our own heads. So I mean, I love the fact that your text is able to kind of produce the effect that it is, like itself is, but produce the same effect in kind of the audience. And I mean, I find it a very interesting feat of queer writing, though I don't know if it's a label that you want to associate it with, but I felt that it's kind of, for me, this is a very inspirational text. So my comment is basically being a fun girl, very adult of me, but I wanted to say that because I think that you've expressed certain hesitance maybe about this type of writing, and I'm just very much wowed by it. So, and I will not share all of my associations because we would spend another day here, but I just wanted to thank you for exposing us and our students to this type of writing, because I think it is extremely powerful.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for obviously the invite, the opportunity to share, and I guess the space. I think when I said initially in our emails that I might do something a bit new, I think you responded with a lot of enthusiasm, and I think that was I took that as a green light to go wild. So I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad you got something from it. That's a nice phrase, a nice sentiment.
Thank you. Just to finish off, this is one of the associations I had during the with Ren Hang's kind of photographs. I'm going to post it here, and I know it's weird, but just kind of just thinking about subjects, props, human. This is from Kourtney Kardashian's Instagram, right? Where she, she kind of uses her friend's body as a prop, and her friend is of Asian descent. So there's been kind of like going on a whole discussion about subjectivity. You know, who's prop, or an object in this photograph, and it's one of those associations that I don't want to even discuss today. It's just something that came to my head when you were discussing subjectivity at the end, and I think this is what Marta had said beautifully, that your lecture kind of opened so many different doors and windows, and some of them lead here to Kardashian's Instagram, right, of all things. But I'm sure that there are more windows and doors being opened as we speak for our listeners. So thank you so much for the lecture, and I hope we can organize something in person, maybe in the fall or next year, because we would love to have you here, maybe for a workshop with kind of smaller group of people. That would be really, really perfect. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see everyone in I think 2 weeks time for our last speaker's lecture, Łukasz Muniowski from our university. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions and your attention as well. Yeah, I would love to be there in person.
Great. Thank you.